get right to it. Um, as I said, the heart of this course is the guest speakers that we have, who are, I think, invaluable because I couldn't present, or nor do I have all the subject matter expertise that they do on the variety of topics. So tonight we have Smith Kalita. Smith Kalita is he's a good guy. He is a graduate of our program. He's an alumni. Um, and I'm going to read his bio. Experienced program project manager, management analyst, 17 years of government consulting experience, providing performance improvement, human systems integration, major systems acquisition, program support for DoD and federal clients. He's a certified performance technologist through ISPI. He holds a Kirkpatrick Principal Evaluator, Phillips Return on Investment, and he's a project management professional certified professional. Smith is also certified in Saba, incorporating peak performance systems, optimizing human performance front-end analysis, train design, and train development methodology, and is certified to conduct optimizing human performance front-end analysis. So he has certifications coming out the yin yang. He's a very qualified guy. Following his retirement from the Coast Guard, aviator of 24 years of active duty, Smith accepted an offer as an associate with Booz Allen Hamilton Incorporated. During his 12 years with Booz Allen, Smith led or contributed to numerous performance improvement and human systems integration projects related to military, rotary wing, and fixed wing aircraft, unmanned air systems, command and control, communications, computers, intelligence, surveillance, and recon. Smith served as a senior human factors engineer supporting validation, alternatives, analysis, capabilities, evaluation, production. He has also served as an adjunct instructor with Booz Allen Center for Performance Excellence and has co-developed or co-facilitated project management workshops for DoD and federal clients. During his period of employment, he received numerous awards, which is no surprise to me. That included Booz Allen's highest personal achievement award and promoted to senior associate. He completed, this is the important part, his Master of Arts in Instructional Systems Development at UMBC. In September of 2012, Smith resigned from Booz Allen and pursued employment opportunities as an independent management consultant. So, that is Smith Kalita. I like to call him Smitty. Smitty, welcome home. It's great to have you here.
Yeah, Greg, thanks for the kind introduction, and I also want to say I'm flattered that you would consider inviting me to present during this course, because it was about 12 years ago I took the class myself. So it's good to see that some traditions endure.
Well, we're fortunate to have you. Thank you.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone. Please call me Smitty, as Greg does. That's a lot less formal than Smith, which sounds kind of preppy, even though I didn't go to a prep school. But the topic that I chose to present this evening, if you can see it on your screens at home, is a holistic approach to optimizing human performance. Can everyone on the call see that?
It might be easiest
I hope I'm not on
to chat
mute.
your response in.
I can see it.
Good. Just want to make sure the technology is not failing us.
I'm seeing the chat
Okay.
function indicating they can see it, Smitty.
All right. Well, then we'll continue. So just so we can get a little better acquainted with each other, and I have a little bit of an idea of your backgrounds. If we could just please go around, and if you would just please give me your name and organization you're affiliated with, either an employer or a volunteer organization or a nonprofit, and what the goal of that organization is, and finally, what is it that you accomplish through your affiliation with that organization. And we can go in any order.
I guess I'll start. This is Melody Wright, and my organization is UNBC. And the goal of the organization, obviously, is education. And I am the head administrator for the biology department. So I do all manner of student, staff, faculty affairs.
Great. Sounds interesting. Thank you. Thank you, Melody. Anyone else care to share with the group?
I can go next. My name is Karen Tavares. I am employed by the U.S. government, and the goal of my agency is to provide protection for the citizens of the United States through what we do. My job relates to that mission by designing training. There's a lot of smart people, way smarter than me, who take very specialized training where I work. So I get a lot of satisfaction out of that.
I'm sure. Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks, Karen.
My name is Dave Snoots. I work for a mid-sized healthcare company that's called Novalon. They perform various like data and like analytic services within the healthcare landscape, and they also have certain like services that are designed to provide like member services, such as like in-home assessments and things of that nature. And with this company, I kind of wear the hats of both like facilitator as well as an instructional designer.
Good. Thanks, David. Any other volunteers?
Rhonda, I have unmuted you if you're able to speak now.
Okay, thank you. I typed my response just in case. Rhonda Shields. I am, I guess my industry is higher education. I work for UMUC in the Office of the Registrar. I'm one of the associate directors, and my primary responsibility is conducting training for staff within the office. It's about 120 of us. And I guess the goal of the university is providing, education classes and degree conferrals for career accomplishments.
Excellent. Thank you. It's good to know someone in the registrar's office.
Yes.
See, about my transcript, Rhonda. Well, I'll talk to you later.
Gotcha.
Was there one more person on the line?
Melody, have you gone?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. How about Rebecca? We have two of them. Have both Rebeccas gone? Okay, I'm trying to unmute you, Rebecca Dongera. Okay, there you go.
Good evening. I hope everyone can hear me.
Loud and clear.
Okay, great. So I work at UMBC. My name is Rebecca
Yeah.
Dongera, and I'm the Data and Events Coordinator in the College of Natural and Mathematical Sciences there. I see one of the goals, certainly with the grant that I work with, as lifting up support mechanisms for students who are underrepresented. Specifically with STEM majors with a biomedical focus. And so as the data person, I try to capture as much information as I can to forward that information to our leadership within the college so they can look at the analytics and make some decisions as to how to best support those students, as well as the faculty that work with them on a daily basis.
Well, it sounds like a position that gives you a lot of job satisfaction.
It does. And the other hat that I wear that I failed to mention was that I'm also the event coordinator. So I organize symposiums that allow the students to go out and share their research that they've done, whether that be during the school year or during the summer.
Great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Yeah, there used to be a series of events that Greg organized where he would have esteemed folks in the field of ISD come and give presentations in the evenings a couple of times a year. And I really enjoyed attending those. Especially Thiagi. I think Thiagi came one year, right, Greg?
He did. He actually came more than once.
Yeah, I went to one of those. It was very informative.
Yeah, he actually joked with me. He said, he's like, I'm not a spring chicken, so if you want to hear me speak again, don't wait too long.
You better hurry up. Yeah, when the groundhogs are delivering my mail, it's going to be too late. Okay, well, thanks, everyone. I have a little bit of an idea of kind of your backgrounds. And as we go through our class tonight, it will dawn on you that third bullet, the job accomplishment, is really a trick question. So with that, I'll leave you in suspense for a couple minutes, and we'll carry on here.
Smitty, before we move on, I think we might have one more person. Rebecca Griffin, have you shared with us yet?
Oh, okay. No, I haven't.
Right.
So my name's Rebecca Griffin. I work for Erickson Retirement Community. I work in the IT department for their training and development team.
Oh, good.
I think their main goal is just, improving the senior living environment. But we work with like a lot of databases, so they're gearing up for a lot of training with the new databases that they're bringing on.
Great. And so how would you describe your job accomplishment?
I have a lot of job tasks. I haven't really accomplished in my mind a lot of things yet. I think on the bigger picture, just developing training programs and training on those programs, I guess you could say is an accomplishment, but more of a task to me.
Okay. Well, thank you. And I apologize for failing to recognize you were on the call.
Oh, no worries. No worries.
Okay. Do we have everyone? I'm just so anxious to get started. You have no idea.
I think everyone has been given a chance to share, unless I'm missing the boat here.
No, thank you. Yeah, this will, like I say, this will become apparent here a little later in the class. But so, okay, now if you can just, imagine, if you will, you're associated with an organization that, every member of that organization is really performing at the top of their game. They have the right skills, they got the right tools, There are no barriers in the workplace that would prevent them from doing the absolute best job possible. And it was very clear what their role prescription was. They knew what was expected of them, and there was no conflict in terms of what they were expected to produce. And the work environment, they had everything they needed: the policies and procedures, support, anything that they might have needed to accomplish their jobs was provided by the employer or by the organization. And of course, that would be expected to lead to a lot of a feeling of teamwork and collegiality and camaraderie. And if you think back in some of the greatest moments in the history of our country, there are some glaring examples of this. For those of you who can remember the 1980 Winter Olympics, when the U.S. defeated the Russian hockey team. I mean, I think that's an example of an organization, in this case, the team, that was at the top of their game, and it was just clicking for them, and they pulled one of the greatest upsets in the history of the century. I think another good example might be Operation Desert Storm, which, as unfortunate as warfare is, I think General Schwarzkopf and his staff and the Marines and the Navy and the Air Force and the Army all performed brilliantly. And, that conflict was over almost before you knew it. And I think one more example might be and I got to talk about the Coast Guard, their response to Hurricane Katrina, which devastated the coast of Louisiana and the surrounding areas in the Gulf Coast. And after kind of a slow start, where the director of FEMA, I think his name was Brown, got down there and wasn't doing well, the president called Thad Allen, who was the vice commandant of the Coast Guard, and sent him down there to take over for Mr. Brown. And Admiral Allen called aircraft in from almost all of the Coast Guard air stations around the country, and I think there was 23 of them at the time. And some of those aircraft converged on New Orleans, and they operated out of the Coast Guard air station there. And that was some pretty hazardous flying. It was very high risk, high op tempo. And I think the number that was cited, they rescued some 30,000 people. And no one on the Coast Guard team was hurt, and they didn't lose any aircraft. And that was some pretty dense airspace at the time. So again, a good example, I think, of people had the right tools and equipment. They knew what they were expected to do, and the organization supported them, and they did it. And it was a good outcome. So what's the big deal about human performance improvement? Well, it's a pretty competitive workforce these days, and a workplace these days. Companies like Intel and Microsoft and some of these high-tech companies are coming out with new products very quickly that requires us as the users to learn how to use them, or workers in the workplace are expected to be able to perform quickly in a changing business environment. Reduction of waste, rework, which costs companies money, keeping your customers happy. And as most of you know, training is a very expensive proposition for an organization in terms of instructors, developing courseware, and the opportunity cost of employees sitting in a classroom or sitting in a computer online undergoing training when they could be working and producing products that are of value to the company that they work for. So in tonight's class, here's what I hope you'll be able to take away at the end. I hope you'll be able to intelligently describe what we mean by project alignment, and we're going to present two FEA methodologies associated with tonight's class. It's a new performance planning front-end analysis, which is done when employees are going to be producing new products or new outcomes. And then there's a diagnostic FEA methodology, which is more like problem solving, where employees are not producing the things that they should, or they're not producing them to the desired standard. And the holistic approach in the title refers to what we call interventions. Of course, skill and knowledge interventions, we're talking about training. But taking a more holistic approach, we will also look at things like assignment and selection. Are the right people being hired, and are they being assigned to jobs for which they have the aptitude or the skill? And motivation and incentives, hiring folks is an expensive proposition. I think the number that was cited when I worked at Booz Allen was it cost about $30,000 to hire a new employee by the time you got them in the building and got them their initial 4-day training orientation. Everybody in that room, it was costing the company about $30,000. And the final thing we will be presenting tonight are some best practices when interviewing accomplished performers and subject matter experts, and we'll define those terms in a minute. So any questions so far? And please, I would encourage questions as we go through the class tonight. I'm hoping this is more of a discussion than just a presentation. All right, then, we'll continue. So what we're going to be talking about is something known as the Saba Peak Performance System. As you read in my bio, I am certified to teach the first of the 3 phases of that peak performance system, the front-end analysis part, which is, some people call it a training needs assessment or a needs analysis. Normally when I facilitate the workshop, it's a 3-day process. So you might suspect that some of the slides from that workshop are used in the presentation tonight, and they are, because I think Saba did a pretty good job in producing them. And then the outputs from the front-end analysis feed the design phase, and then the outputs of the design phase feed the development and evaluation phases. It's very similar to the ADDIE model, with the exception of it does address some of those other interventions I'd mentioned, engineering the workplace and picking the right people and motivating them. So a little bit of history of this process. It was actually developed by a fellow named Joe Harless, who actually was a behavioral psychologist who focused on program instruction. And he did a lot of this work back in the early 60s with what you might consider the human performance rat pack that included Tom Gilbert and Robert Mager, names you may recognize from some of the classes you've taken at UMBC, some of the heavy hitters in the field of instructional design and human performance. And among his many achievements, Dr. Harless was the president of ISPI for a time. Now, he made the acquaintance of a fellow, Dr. Paul Elliott, who was also a psychologist, and they worked together for a while. And when Dr. Harless was reaching the point in his career where he felt like retiring, he sold the intellectual property rights of this process to Paul Elliott. And at the time, that process was known as the performance improvement process. Well, it just so happens Dr. Elliott has a business, Exemplary Performance, down in Annapolis. And I made his acquaintance about 15 or so years ago. and he actually taught me the process, and he also certified me to teach the 3-day workshop. And the connection here will come full circle. The Coast Guard in the mid-90s decided to establish a performance technology center at their base in Yorktown, Virginia. And some of the first people they contacted for some guidance were Dr. Harless and Dr. Elliott, who helped them stand up that capability down at their training center. Any questions so far? Are we good? Okay, so the peak performance system, it's really almost a soup to nuts solution. It begins with the process of what we call alignment. And one of the outcomes of the alignment process is a decision whether a new performance planning FEA or a diagnostic FEA is indicated. And the outputs of those processes provide inputs to the planning of the interventions. And as we mentioned before, we're talking about assignment and selection and skill and knowledge, engineering the work environment to remove barriers, and motivation and incentives. And then, of course, to kind of finish up the process, we talk about implementing and evaluating the effectiveness of those interventions. And so the goal of this whole peak performance system is to enhance the performance of an organization by improving the performance of the workforce through the analysis and the design and development and the evaluation of those performance enhancing interventions. I think before we go much further, it would be helpful if we talk about some key terms. The first is the accomplished performer, and the accomplished performer could be the subject matter expert, but might not necessarily be a subject matter expert. The accomplished performer is the performers in an organization that do a job better than anyone else. For whatever reason, they have figured out the best way to produce something in terms of speed and quality and few defects. The subject matter expert could be an AP and vice versa, but the subject matter expert tends to be someone in the organization that understands not only what to do and how to do it, but really like the value of what that process is. And it's the subject matter expert who kind of understands, in addition to the what, the subject matter expert understands the why. The whys of, why do we build widgets or looms or whatever it is we're trying to produce. And so the job accomplishment is the output that an employee produces. It tends to be a noun rather than a verb, as we will dissect later in the class. And the major accomplishment are those interim outputs or outcomes that in the course of their work day or their work week, an employee produces that when taken collectively, the 5 or 6 or 7 major accomplishments lead to the job accomplishment. We're also going to be talking a little bit about behaviors, also known as tasks. And these tend to be verbs, and they tend to be either overt or covert. And the overt is something that is normally observable. It's an action. Somebody, bolting a tire onto a car on an assembly line. And the covert, it's a mental process. When somebody needs to decide something or somebody needs to solve a problem. And finally, performance, it's just a summary term. that really combines the behaviors and the major accomplishments, and that's what we define as performance. Everybody doing okay?
Yep.
Okay, so, you know, why bother? Why bother with HPT? You know, what's the point of the exercise? Well, a couple of business case examples here. You'll see on this graphic, the vertical axis is the percentage of the workforce, and the horizontal or the x-axis is level of performance. And I'm going to click through this animation here. Okay, so when you plot the percentage of the workforce and the level of performance, you get sort of a bell-shaped curve. And the minimal performers in the workforce, that could be someone like me. Whereas the exemplary performer in a workforce would be someone like Dr. Williams. And then there's all sorts of levels of performance in between. But generally speaking, as with the bell curve, the majority of the workforce performs to standards. You know, they're doing okay. So what's the potential impact between the standard performer and the exemplary performer? Well, if you can somehow come up with some methods for moving that old standard to the right so that even your average performer performs more like the rock star performer, well, that's what we call the value proposition. That's why organizations invest the money in an attempt to improve the workplace performance of the entire workforce or parts of it. So we talked about two separate models of the FEA process, the new performance planning and the diagnostic. And again, the new performance planning is when an organization is going to produce something new that they haven't produced before, or maybe they're going to introduce some new equipment or some new processes in their workplace. So we ask ourselves, okay, well, what's the goal of the organization? And that's why I asked you folks, when you're introducing yourselves, to define what the goal of your organization was. And then next, we look at the accomplishments. What is it that the employees or the workforce, what do they have to produce in order to align with the goals of the organization? And a classic example is buggy whips. You can be the best buggy whip maker at General Motors, but you know, General Motors doesn't make buggy whips, they make cars. So then what behaviors are needed to produce the job accomplishment? And the behaviors, again, are tasks. Those are the activities. And finally, what interventions are needed to influence those behaviors? In other words, so that those behaviors produce outputs that meet the high standards of the organization. And the new performance planning really is more like problem prevention, whereas the diagnostic seeks problem resolution. So in a similar manner, we will ask ourselves, well, what organizational goal is deficient? What is not being met? And related to that, what accomplishments are not being produced or are not being produced to the level expected or to the acceptable standard? And this is likely due to deficient behaviors. What tasks are not being performed properly or in a timely manner in order to produce those accomplishments? And finally, what influences are absent? Is it skill and knowledge training? Again, is it poor workplace design? Is it the environment? Is it unmotivated employees? Or did the organization hire the wrong people? So Dr. Harless's theory is if you can select high-performing employees, train them to produce the accomplishments that they're expected to produce that align with the goals of the organization, engineer their work environment to minimize barriers, and motivate them, reward them for good performance. And conversely, you may need to sanction a few of those people who are not performing to expectations. So along this line, we're talking about an organization providing the required support to its workforce so they can perform the processes, the tasks, the behaviors that they need to in the workplace to produce the accomplishments that are of value to the organization, that have a positive outcome, that meet the goals of the organization. So as you can see here on the bottom, the performance unfolds from left to right, but when we do our analysis, we analyze from the top down. We start by defining the goals. And as you'll see, as you learn more about this process, there's a very logical reason for that. So it's the influences and the behaviors that cost the organization resources, time, money. But going back to the value proposition, it's those accomplishments and meeting the goals of the organization that the organization values. So, behaviors produce accomplishments. Here's some good examples. Behaviors: make a presentation, plan work, inspect work. And what are the outcomes or the outputs of that? Well, it could be sales of the product, or in this case, productive subordinates, productive workers. And it's important that we discriminate between behavior and accomplishment. As I mentioned earlier, the behaviors tend to be verbs like answer questions, decide, troubleshoot, fabricate. And the accomplishments tend to be nouns like sales, profits, product and inventory. And I mentioned earlier that we do our analysis from the top down. So this is what the model considers to be the hierarchy of a worker's performance. You got the job, and then there may be a specialty to that job. So for example, let's say the job is a medical doctor. A specialty could be a pediatrician. The job accomplishment could be a healthy patient. That's the outcome, that's the output. And then those interim accomplishments, the major accomplishments, could be things like, healthy heart, healthy lungs, and the tasks associated with that major accomplishment, of course, are, things like diagnose, treat, and each task may have certain steps. There may be steps involved with diagnosing a condition or treating a condition. And as you recall from a little bit earlier in the class, we talked about project alignment. That's one of our learning objectives. So, what do we mean when we say project alignment? Well, usually the process involves some type of request from a client, or your boss walks into your office and says, Smitty, hey, I got a job for you. So there's a stimulus. So the process of project alignment is conducted very early in the process, in the client engagement. in meeting with the client and having them explain to you the performance that is targeted. In other words, it's going to be a new output that's going to be produced, or it's an output that is not being produced to standard. And you also discuss, as with any in any project, what are the constraints and the parameters. One of the examples in one of the analyses we did was the accomplished performers were union members, and so we had to get permission to interview them in the workplace to make sure that we weren't violating any of the union's rules. And roles and inputs. Who's going to do what? Who are the organization's recognized accomplished performers, and who are their subject matter experts? Who are the folks that we want to sit down and talk to get the data that we need to do the analysis? And finally, what's the priority? Is there a deadline? And what is the desired outcome? These are all the things that we determine during the alignment phase. Oop, no, I don't want to do that. I'm just trying to minimize this thing. Because I'm being partially blocked here. But anyway, so the outcome, one of the outcomes of the alignment phase is a decision. Which methodology is indicated? Does it call for new performance planning or a diagnostic front-end analysis? Now, this whole process is driven by job aids that we, the analysts, use to collect the data that we need to develop our interventions. And this is a screenshot of a project alignment job aids, and all the processes, or all the phases in this FEA process are guided by these job aids. And the point of me showing you these isn't so you can read them, because I realize you probably cannot, but I guess what I'm trying to impress upon everyone, this is very cookbook. It's very rigorous. It's very valid. It's reliable. And with any research project, you want to strive for validity and reliability. And all of the job aids in the beginning of each phase, they list the tasks that we, the analysts, will perform to gather the data that we need. And then here are the steps, and the job aids will tell you, ask the AP this, or ask the AP to provide an example of something. And you just work your way through the job aid. And while you're doing that, you record the answers on these pre-formatted forms. When this was first developed, very paper-intensive process. Attempts have been made to automate it, but and we tried that. We tried using the computer-based system, but we found that the paper-based system was actually easier to manage. In fact, in one case, we lost a data file that had data that we had gathered from a site visit, and we had to go regather it. It was not a good, it was not a good day. Okay, so we use the job aids and the summary sheets to collect the data and to organize it, because we're going to need to analyze it in subsequent steps. So the outputs of project alignment will serve as the inputs to the next step. And you can see there's some of the outcomes, the documentation, the request, making sure we understand what the goals of the organization are, what the goals of the project is, the important roles in the project, and any constraints or parameters we might have to contend with. So we're going to take a little break here for a little pulse check. Get caught up.
Smitty, this is Greg.
Yes, sir.
You have some questions being sent in the under the question function, which isn't always obvious in this GoToWebinar program. If you can find that and click it on, that's fine. If you cannot, I'll be happy to read the questions to you.
Well, let's see. I see the chat.
And yeah, keep following down that column. There is a kind of a gray horizontal band that will say questions.
I'm not seeing that. Sorry.
Okay. All right. Well, then how about I just read these questions to you?
Sure.
Okay, so here's one from Rebecca Griffin. Do you find that more employees move from the standard to exemplary or standard to minimal? If the move backwards to minimal, how do you get them back to standard?
Yeah, I in my experience of doing this over the last 12 or 13 or 14 years, I don't know of any case where the worker or that portion of the workforce regressed. That's a good question, and it may have happened, but if it did happen, it must have happened subsequent to our engagement.
Okay.
Does that answer the question?
Rhonda, does that answer your question?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry I can't see your questions on my screen. I apologize.
It's probably some setting that I messed up on, so I apologize. I have a couple of other questions.
Okay, this is a good time.
All right. Do you find that more, why in particular are the high performers? Why in particular, just repeat. Yeah, why in particular are the high performers? That's the whole question. So I'm not sure if I missed part of it, but that's what was in there.
Okay, I think I understand it. Because it's the high performers who have somehow figured out, by virtue of their training or their aptitudes, or for whatever reason that this analysis will hopefully help us to uncover, are the ones that do it the best. So if we can extract from them what it is that makes them such high performers, and then take that and embed that in the remaining portions of the workforce, the idea is to shorten the time to competence of your average performer and help them move further to the right on that performance axis. So essentially what we're doing is we're collecting lessons learned and best practices from those workers who have demonstrated it, and then we're trying to inculcate that into the other workers. Does that answer the question?
Rhonda, that was your question, I believe. Rhonda, I've unmuted you.
Thank you. I do, it does answer the question. I just sometimes think, because that is a conversation that I know I often have with my managers about that, because we do have in my environment such a bell curve where we have that small percentage of those high performers, and we do try to model what they know and how they perform and try to capture that information so we can share that with everyone else. And the challenge has always been exactly relaying that information to the other performers, because the high performers already have it, they're already there. But my struggle has always been, how exactly do we capture that so that it can be relayed to the other workers, so everyone is performing.
Right. Yeah, Rhonda, I thank you for the question. I do completely understand it. And really that is the point of the exercise here is this is a tried and true methodology for, again, identifying what it is or how those exemplary performers achieve the results that they do, and then packaging it in ways that it can then be transferred to other workers to help them improve their performance. And that's exactly what going through this process does. That is the epitome of what this process does. You know, this is a paradigm shift. This is, it was for me when I first learned it. It's a different way of thinking about, you know, workplace performance improvement. And it's hard in some cases for some folks to get their arms around it. And I can give you an example. You know, when we sit down with some folks who an organization has identified as an accomplished performer, and we ask them, and I'm going to use an example from the Coast Guard, let's say an aircraft mechanic, because I'm most familiar with that. And so we ask the mechanic, well, what is it you produce in a day or a week or a month? He says, well, you know, I overhaul engines, and, you know, I rig flight controls, and I, you know, repair leaky hydraulic systems. And we're like, okay, yeah, that's good. But what is it you produce? Well, you know, I rebuild engines and I repair leaky hydraulics. and so we have to actually, in the beginning, train the accomplished performer, the people that we're interviewing, that's what they do. What they produce is an aircraft that's in flyable condition or is mission ready. That's what they produce. And they produce that mission ready aircraft by engaging in behaviors or tasks such as overhauling an engine, or, you know, rigging a flight control, or fixing a leaky hydraulic system. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, so going back to the introductions. I'm not going to mention names, but think about what your answers were when I asked you what your job accomplishment was. Almost all of you expressed it in terms of verbs, not nouns. So it's a paradigm shift, if you will, and that's fundamental to this process. If you want to use this process, you have to understand that we're looking at workplace performance from a different perspective, and that's why they call it accomplishment-based, as opposed to subject matter-based. It's all about accomplishments that align with the goals of the organization. And as the analyst, you have to keep telling yourself that over and over and over again until it becomes second nature. Thank you for the question. Are we good? All right, then. We'll continue. So that was a good place to break, and we're just going to do a little knowledge review here, thanks to the magic of PowerPoint. And so if you do have audio, you can respond. We can discuss it, or you can do this silently yourself. But sales reps aren't selling the existing product. Well, we think a diagnostic analysis would be indicated, because it's something that's not being produced to the required standard, and it's not necessarily a new outcome or a new output. As opposed to the next examples, the sales force will be required to sell a new product. So, all right, that's new performance planning. Or the company that's going to upgrade one of their production lines that just happens to be located in Detroit with similar new equipment that they've already installed in another plant somewhere. So the people in Detroit are going to need to learn how to use this new equipment. So we believe that a new performance planning FEA would be indicated. Another one, motivation is low here. Can you help us? And then usually the next statement is, we need training. Well, maybe you do, maybe you don't. But in any case, again, it's problem resolution, low morale. So that would indicate a diagnostic methodology. And here we go, warranty costs too high, we need training. Again, maybe you do, maybe you don't. But until you do the FEA, you won't know. So you could spend a whole lot of money developing training that's not needed or won't work. Okay, so we'll take a look at the new performance planning FEA process, and I'm hoping that it will answer some of your questions, but please, if you do have questions as we go through, get them to Greg and he can get them to me.
Smitty, I had to step away for a minute, and if you've answered this question, I apologize, because it sounded like you might have. Have you ever run into an issue where the client requested something, and after completing the alignment, you realize that what was being requested is not what was truly needed? How do you communicate those findings to the client?
Yeah, we have not addressed that question yet. That's an excellent question. Thank you for whoever asked it.
That was from Rebecca Griffin.
Okay, thanks, Rebecca. Yes. Again, it's not untypical that your client will think they need training, or they think they need some other intervention. And, your job as a consultant is you need to, there's no delicate way to say this. You try to convince them that maybe is not what they need after all, but you do it in such a way that they think they have come up with the idea that maybe it isn't training that they need after all. Does that make sense to folks? If you're a good consultant, you'll kind of let the client think that the solution was their idea to begin with.
Right.
Now, you're not tricking them. You're just kind of you're just helping them to see things your way.
Smitty, have you ever run into a situation where you found that the leadership was pushing the training when maybe in reality they were more responsible for some of the issues and either didn't know what to do or didn't take action?
I could imagine a situation where that could happen. I can't recall any specific engagements that I had. That resulted in that scenario.
Okay.
But it's not hard to imagine it happening.
Okay.
In the grand scheme of things, and I think again, as long as you as the consultant are able to support your position with logic and previous outcomes, and again, helping them to kind of think that, yeah, that's a great idea. I'm glad I thought of it.
Thank you.
Did that address the question, Greg?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, again, you're not tricking them. You're just kind of trying to help them see things your way. Because you've done this before and perhaps they haven't. Okay, good. So, a new performance planning, it's the client has a new goal. It may require new outputs from the workforce. And in order to produce those new outputs, they may need to engage in new actions. And you certainly want to set them up for success by providing them everything they need to include an environment that's conducive to the new outputs. So, as we have tried to emphasize earlier, the performance unfolds from the interventions, the behaviors that produce the accomplishments that meet the goals of the organization. But as I mentioned before, we start at the top, work our way down. And so one of the outcomes of the alignment process is you need to get a clarification of the goals of the organization, and you need to get clarification of the goals of the analysis. What is it that they're expecting? What's the expectation for them paying you to do the work? Okay, and this is kind of in keeping with that performance hierarchy that we talked about a little earlier. So when we talk about major accomplishments, again, we're talking about outcomes, not activities. So here are just some notional outcomes for the major accomplishments of a nuclear reactor operator. So the organization that operates the nuclear reactor, well, their goal is they want to make a profit. They're a utility. They want to keep the shareholders happy. And for this reactor operator, their job accomplishment could be electricity is on the grid. Electricity from the reactor is on the grid, so it can be sold. And so in the course of their day or their week or their month, they might produce data through various processes. They may have a plant that's operating normally after some type of reactor problem, or the plant would be stable after some type of an emergency. And the plant is operating properly after load changes, and the plant is ready after the nuclear fuel has been replaced. And again, for probably the fifth time, accomplishments are generally nouns, not verbs. So the behavior, in this case, would be train the students, but the accomplishment would be, an educated student. So we collect the data from the accomplished performers using the job aid, and we record that data on the summary sheets. And then once we have identified all the major accomplishments associated with a job accomplishment, we categorize those into three categories that you see there. A normal major accomplishment is something that's produced routinely through the course of work activities. An off-normal major accomplishment is something that's non-routine. It only is produced occasionally, and usually by something that doesn't go according to plan. And finally, emergency. They are non-routine, they're predictable, and they tend to have high consequences or high costs. And we do this because they help us make design and development decisions when we get to that phase of the project, and it helps us to prioritize the major accomplishments associated with a job. So a normal accomplishment might be, record of sales transaction. An off-normal might be, well, the computer system's down, or the cash register, the network is down, So we need to revert to manual methods for, issuing, recording transactions and issuing receipts. And finally, the emergency, it could be something like, you don't lose the client. You're the national cash register company, and all the cash registers, throughout an organization, like they just stopped working. But you've managed to resolve the problem, and that organization is still going to continue to use your cash register. Okay, so we have our list of major accomplishments, and we have categorized them as normal, off normal, or emergency. And then the next thing we do is, for each of those major accomplishments, is we collect data on each one. And some of the data we collect are things like importance. How important is that major accomplishment to the overall job accomplishment? How difficult is it to produce? Are the APs aware of any changes that may occur in the organization that may result in the way that outcome is produced? How much time do they spend in the course of a day or a week or a month producing it? The criteria, what that means is, if you were judging a contest, how would you determine, what criteria would you use to determine that major accomplishment was produced to the desired level? And then interactions with whom or what. And these are all important. And once again, these all help to decide the interventions that will be designed and implemented to improve a worker's performance. This is taken right out of the job aid. This is just one example of, for example, the attribute importance. How would you characterize the importance of that major accomplishment? If it constitutes an intolerable hazard to health or safety, it would be categorized as most important, and so on. And you can see on this particular attribute, it's either most important, important, moderate, or low. So once we have collected the major accomplishments and collected the data on the major accomplishments, we focus on the tasks. So going back to our nuclear power plant operator, if one of the major accomplishments is the plant is stable after some type of an upset in the process, those are some of the tasks that the operator may need to perform to make sure the plant is stable. And as before, we did with the major accomplishments, we also collect data on the tasks, such as speed, the environment, how often the task is performed, the consequences of performing the task incorrectly. Is the way that the task is executed going to change? Is there something that they know they're going to be getting some new equipment or whatever? And then the influences in the workplace, positive and negative. And we talk about negative influences, we're talking about barriers. We're talking about things that are beyond the worker's power to control directly, but yet they impede the worker's ability to do the job as well as they can, or as well as they would even like to. And again, these all feed into design decisions we're going to make further downstream in the process. So I mentioned earlier, prioritizing performance is one of the phases in the FEA process. And Dr. Harless actually developed some algorithms that are used to score each of the major accomplishments so they can be ranked in a prioritized order. And similarly, there are algorithms that he developed to prioritize the tasks associated with each major accomplishment. And, why do you suppose we bother to do this prioritization? Anybody have any ideas?
Well, you have to determine what's important, and the staff, they would need to know what exactly is needed, how they need to put what's important first.
Yes, that is primary. And another reason you prioritize is if resources are limited and you only have so much, and an organization only has so much money to spend to try to prevent the problem or resolve the problem, well, of course, you know, you want to focus your resources on those major accomplishments and tasks that are the most critical. Good answer. Any other thoughts on this one? All right. So we'll continue. Now we talk about skill and knowledge. We're also talking about where is information stored? Is it stored in the brain? Is it stored in a job aid? So, stored entirely in memory, what we're talking about really is as a train to memory intervention. Or we're talking about training supplemented by a job aid. So maybe you produce a job aid and then give the employee some introductory training or even some extensive training, depending on the nature of the major accomplishment. And then we talk about job aids, and that's where that information is stored somewhere else, such as a cookbook or a front-end analysis job aid. This FEA process, it really is biased toward the use of job aids for a number of reasons. It can be more reliable than memory. They're fairly easy to develop when you compare it to the costs of either instructor-led classroom training or the development and delivery of web-based or computer-based training. And job aid's pretty easy to change. If something in the workplace changes, you can just print new job aids, as opposed to, you know, getting all the employees affected together in a classroom or on a computer and unmemorizing the old sequence of steps and memorizing the new sequence of steps. So there's a lot of compelling reasons to use job aids. So you can either do training or job aids or training with job aids, and it can either be extensive or introductory. And as I mentioned, it's kind of biased toward the use of job aids. So what you're really trying to do when you go through this phase is come up with valid reasons to not job aid something. And I mentioned before there were algorithms, and these are in the FEA job aids job aid. So you go through that job aid when you're trying to solve the job aid or train to memory solution. Is a job aid required by a regulation or policy? Well, if it's required by a regulation or policy, then yeah, you job aid. You don't have a choice. And it could be like an OSHA, a safety standard, or, you know, things along that line that the government or maybe even the organization mandates. And you just kind of work your way through these algorithms here. And here's where all those attributes you captured that involve high complexity or high consequences of error, or, you know, is speed necessary? How often is something produced? And the algorithm will give you the answer. And again, there's a accompanying summary sheet where you record the outcomes of this process. And then in terms of extensive training or introductory training or no training, there's a similar algorithm. Perhaps you're in an environment where a job aid can't be used. It's dark, or it's, you know, it's wet, or there's chemicals in the air, for whatever reason. If it's just not practical to use a job aid, well, then the train to memory solution is indicated. And you can see there are algorithms for deciding whether to supplement the job aid with introductory training or in some case, no training. Okay, so now that we solved the training intervention challenge, one of the other influences to an effective workforce are the environment. And it's a large bucket. There's almost a limitless number of environmental interventions that can be called upon, such as, you know, improving the lighting or making the workplace safer, maybe reducing noise, automating part of the job, maybe assign another worker so that you have a team working on it rather than just one person. You know, better tools, better equipment, better processes. In terms of motivation, again, just some examples. You know, praise, recognition, maybe a bonus, maybe you know, a week in the Bahamas or somewhere where the employee wants to go. You can enlarge the job, maybe provide them some flexibility, better benefits. Again, HR folks can help you with this. Oops. And this one, okay. So we can take a break here if you want before we start discussing diagnostic. Anybody need a break?
Smitty, there are a couple of questions since the last, I don't know, 10 or 12 minutes or so.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Well, I want, you know, when they come up, Greg, just please,
Okay.
you know, just don't hesitate to interrupt. We'll
All right.
try to address as they come up.
Okay. So here's one from Rebecca Dongera. Institutional knowledge or organizational knowledge is important, especially if the business is sold, a leader or an AP leaves, or there's a need for division. Job aids seem very important, so I guess that's more of a comment than a question. Another one from Rebecca Dongera. From a cost analysis standpoint, is the FEA or the NPP more affordable to an organization in terms of time and total life cycle project management?
Very good questions. And generally speaking, the solution to the problem should cost less than the problem itself. So, and we're going to talk further about that value proposition more thoroughly when we talk about diagnostic. But even in terms of the new performance planning, as I'd mentioned, you know, the goal of that is problem prevention. So hopefully, you know, faster time to competence, less rework time, you know, fewer rejected parts because they weren't manufactured correctly. You know, there's a whole host of reasons. And again, that can be measured. So I think when an organization releases a request for proposals for someone, you know, to do a performance analysis, I think they have a pretty fair idea of what the problem is costing them. And so when companies like Booz Allen or my company, Tyche Group, or any other organization that does this type of work, when they respond to that request for a proposal with a cost estimate, I think that's going to help the client decide whether, well, do I pay to fix the problem, or do I try to solve it myself, or do I just live with it? I hope that answers the question.
Karen, that was your question.
That was not my question.
Oops, I goofed. Hang on.
That's okay.
We'll get to your
It was
question.
an interesting question. I wish I.
Rebecca Dungara, that was your question, I believe.
Yes, it was. It made me laugh.
I only had
So-
6 more people to go through before I got the right answer on that one.
Yeah, spin the wheel.
It's like when I call for my children, sometimes they get called a cat name. I don't know. Anyway, let's see. So I'm also thinking about when new businesses are started, there's also an argument, I guess, for a new business going into the planning to think about having an NPP on the front end versus to try to fix the problems later down the line.
Yeah, it's the paradox is these processes are fairly rigid, they're fairly strict, they're very well defined, but by the same token, I have found that they are almost always applicable to some type of an organizational problem. I mean, you think of the variety of industries that exist in the United States, from aircraft manufacturing to consulting to data analysis and collection. I mean, these models have been used very effectively in a variety of different industries.
Mm-hmm.
And so here's an example. And this has actually occurred to me a couple of times. An organization is buying a new piece of equipment that they've never used before. But this equipment has been manufactured for a while, so other organizations have purchased it and are using it. Well, for the new performance planning FEA, that's who you go talk to. You talk to the organization that perhaps has been using it for a while. You do the FEA, and then when the organization gets this piece of equipment that they've never used before, they're going to be one step ahead because it's going to shorten their learning curve on how to best employ that equipment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good example.
Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you.
So, and I'll bring it closer to home. The Coast Guard was buying some new high-speed boats that would do 45 knots across the water to replace their older boats that would only do 20 knots across the water, and had an entirely, the new boats they were buying had a water jet drive rather than propellers and rudders. And so we found some organizations that was operating similar boats, one of which was a firefighting organization. They had some of these boats, so we went and talked to them on not only how to operate these boats, but how to maintain them. Because there's a whole cadre of boat engineers that would need to know how to maintain these boats when they're placed in service. That's easier to do in a government organization. The government organizations tend to be a little more forthcoming with their expertise than, say, competing commercial interests.
Mm-hmm.
But it can be done. And failing all else, you go talk to the manufacturer. And you try to get the expertise from them because they've obviously gone through the developmental testing. Somebody had to test the asset, the boat, the airplane, whatever, before they went into full-scale production. And so you can talk to the people who did that testing and get the information from them. There's a lot of creative ways to get the information you need.
Mm-hmm. Seems like that would be important when you have to justify costs and expenditures.
Absolutely. Well, you know, I don't know if you have much experience in the consulting world, but you know, you spend a lot of time writing proposals, hoping that you win the task order. And so the good news is you won the task order, but the bad news is now you have to do the work that you said you were going to do. Was that helpful?
Yes, that was helpful for me. Hopefully it was helpful for others.
Okay. Does anybody need a break?
So far, people are.
Okay.
I think people are saying they're okay.
Okay. This is going to go a little quicker than the first half because there won't be a lot of definition of terms or those kinds of things.
Smitty,
So
I do have another question for you. Dive into it.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
These are the ones that Karen made, a couple related ones. Should the job aid be the first priority? In other words, don't consider training if it can be done with a job aid. And then she kind of follows on and says, I can understand the advantages, but what about an example for a book on Photoshop as opposed to training on Photoshop? Some users would be overwhelmed by a book.
Yes, I agree. And again, that's what the algorithms that we reviewed help with, that training versus job aid decision. And again, and that in turn is based on the attributes of the major accomplishments and the tasks. So for something complex like your example, I can think of some software applications where I bought the book, but along with the book came a laminated plastic job aid or a card that kind of walked the user through some of the more common operations in that software. And I agree, again, depending on the application, and that's a good example where, you know, some training along with the job aid would be indicated. I think a great example would be, you know, learning how to fly. You know, pilots use checklists, which are job aids, and they have a flight manual, but you could read the flight manual from cover to cover. And until you get in the plane, you know, and start the engine and have the instructor demonstrate certain things and then allow you to perform them under his or her watchful eye. I think that's an example of extensive training with job aid. Or perhaps, you know, the nuclear power plant operator would need extensive training with job aids, but some things would have to be committed to long-term memory, such as emergency procedures, where seconds count. And that's why you collect that information. If seconds count, that is something that's a task that should be committed to long-term memory. That would be an emergency procedure, like an engine failure in an aircraft, or a fire in an aircraft. So once you've taken those first emergency action steps, you execute those from memory, then you can pull out the checklist and review to make sure you did everything right. Was that helpful?
Karen, I've unmuted you.
Thank you. Yes, that was helpful.
Okay, good.
I was just kind of thinking, pardon me?
Good. I'm glad that was helpful. Do you have a follow-on question?
Well, I was just thinking in terms of why you might go with training over a job aid. And the only negative feedback I've ever had on job aids is just if they take too long. You know, if they have to think about, like the example you gave with a little crib sheet for software, you know, keyboard shortcuts is a good one. But if they have to look at a table of contents and then go find something, sometimes the job aids don't get used. So I would just kind of weighing that. But it sounds like job aids are meant to be short and quick.
Yeah, I guess, well, yeah, I guess, for example, a cookbook. Okay, you could consider a cookbook a job aid. At least I can visualize that.
Right.
But, you know, there are hundreds of recipes typically in a cookbook. So, and you wouldn't necessarily need to use all of them.
Yeah.
You know, if you want to make like meatloaf, well, you look up the recipe for the meatloaf, and then the meatloaf recipe is the job aid, not the entire whole cookbook. It's like that cookbook is like a compendium of job aids.
Yes.
Or a collection of job aids.
Yes. So that's probably why a software manual seems overwhelming, because it's actually a bunch of little skills or a bunch of maybe learning objectives in a larger book. And each idea, each learning objective that the person may look for would be considered one job aid. I'm just kind of talking out loud, but
no, that's good. Yeah, and I can think of a practical example in my experience. We got a new phone system installed down in Coast Guard headquarters, and it was a voice over IP, VoIP,
mm-hmm.
And each phone came with a user guide, and these phones were unnecessarily complicated. I mean, they had tremendous capabilities.
I think I have one of those on my desk.
Yeah,
it takes
yeah.
forever.
I think you could remotely control the space station from the phone.
Yeah.
But, you know, it was like it was not intuitive at all. You know, when people are dropping calls and you know they're calling Tasmania and you know all sorts of mayhem is ensued. There was no training. It was just, well, here's your phone, here's the book, read the book, use the phone. Good luck.
Yes.
You know, try not to accidentally dial the president or the commandant.
Right.
So I understand, you know, I understand completely what you're saying.
Okay, that was helpful.
And I think, and actually, you know, in this course, I failed to mention there is actually along with the design and development, there is a workshop on creating job aids. And there are job aids that walk you through the process of creating job aids.
Okay.
Yeah, I know you could go on forever. It's maddening.
I know, it sounds iterative.
But again,
that sounds awesome.
Again, you know, best practices. Yeah. How long should a job aid be? Well,
right.
You know, the answer is it depends.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot about micro-learning too, like how for micro-learning you should have one idea in one piece of micro-learning. Maybe a job aid should maybe be just kind of one idea.
Yeah, it should definitely be user-friendly. I mean, I think that's the number one requirement for a job aid is it's user-friendly. You know, like the book for the VoIP phone. You know, it's like,
yeah.
You know, I'll just wait for somebody to call me, and when it rings, I'll pick it up and you know, I'll punch the lighted button, and hopefully that'll work.
Yep, I have one of those. Everything's buried like five levels down in a menu.
Yeah. Well, this was like back in the early 2000s, so it was even more confounding. Is there a follow-on question, or does someone else have a question?
I'm good.
Okay, well, we'll continue on then. The other model in this peak performance system that we've been discussing is the diagnostic FEA, where the new performance planning was more problem prevention. This one is problem resolution or problem solving. And as with the new performance planning, there's a definite sequence of phases, and this is a graphic representation here. It involves defining the general problem. In other words, you know, why did the customer engage you to help them solve their problem? What are some of the root performance deficiencies that are causing the general problem? What is it that is causing the root performance deficiencies? And this is the hypothesis phase. And then for each of those hypotheses, you gather evidence in the workplace. And that evidence helps you better define the root performance deficiency so that you can then develop interventions to either eliminate that general problem or minimize its effects. So in a diagnostic model, there are 4 basic outputs. Again, the general problem, the root performance deficiency, the causes, and the solutions. So a real world example here, general problem, deficiency in the sales of product X. You know, the CEO is not happy because they're not hitting their sales target for product X. And one of the root performance deficiencies, and there may be multiple, but one could be, well, we don't answer the customer's questions. You know, we're not selling. We're not overcoming objections like, you know, when you get out of the Ford dealer, you know why you don't want to pay $50,000 for a pickup truck. Well, maybe the salespeople, you know, don't know the answer to the questions, or, you know, they don't know effective sales techniques. So perhaps some training is needed. Maybe. So the first major output is a definition of the general problem, and it's usually a multi-part statement such as these. It usually includes what the problem is and what the results of that problem are causing the organization. So, you know, product's not available in inventory, it's not on the shelf, and therefore they can't sell it, and therefore the stockholders are not happy. And again, as we talked earlier a couple times, there's a value proposition here. You know, the solution should be cost effective. So we're talking about what's not produced, what are the results or the effects, what are the long-term consequences to the organization, and what's the cost, what's the value basis. So let's take a look at an example. Company A has been experiencing equipment downtime that results in low productivity. And the cost analysts have determined that for every hour that that piece of equipment is not in service, it's costing the company $6,000 in lost revenues. And historical records have shown that the equipment was inoperative 100 hours last year. So the potential cost for that piece of equipment is $600,000 a year in lost revenues. So if interventions can be developed that cost less than $600,000, then it would be a good value for the company to do so. Okay, so we've looked at the general problem. Let's look at some root performance deficiencies. So if we find a deficient accomplishment that's having a negative impact, we call it the general problem. If there are specific behaviors or tasks that are not being done correctly, we characterize that as a root performance deficiency. And again, there may be multiple root performance deficiencies that are creating the general problem. So there may be missing, one or more influences missing or inadequate as a cause factor for that root performance deficiency. And then once you figure out the cause, you can figure out a solution. Okay, here's a couple of examples of the general problem statement. It identifies who, where, what, and the consequences, as we discussed before. Another example, who, where, what, and the consequences. And when you work through the job aids, you will be developing statements such as this. It kind of guides you through the process. As I mentioned, it could have a GP could have multiple RPDs. It could be salespersons not calling on high probability prospects, or they're not demonstrating the products during calls, contributing to inadequate sales. And this is somewhat of a rhetorical question. I think it's pretty clear that, you know, we break it down, we decompose it, because there may be more than one RPD. We may need to address each one individually in terms of the hypothesis and the solution. There's also, in the model, it addresses what it terms a linked deficiency, in that performer A may be relying on performer B to do something correctly, or performer B may be relying on performer A to do something correctly, and that's not happening. So, pretty simple examples here. You know, the sales clerk writes up a sales slip that's illegible, and that causes the data entry operator to make errors when inputting the data into the computer system. Or a supervisor gives inadequate directions, and so the worker isn't clear on what's expected and maybe performs the task poorly. Or the supervisor who is, you know, pressuring the folks on the assembly line to work faster and produce more volumes in an hour. Now maybe they're producing more volumes, but a higher percentage of them don't work or require some rework. Okay, going through the model, we need to determine why the root performance deficiency exists, and this is where you get to put on your thinking caps and hypothesize. So we're given, during the alignment meeting, data on the problem situation, and we have made a decision that the diagnostic model is indicated, and we have specified the deficient accomplishments and the effects on the general problem. We talked about the who, the what, the where, and the consequences. And it's during this hypothesis analysis phase where we attempt to identify what is causing the root performance deficiency. We don't want to attempt to treat the symptoms. We want to get to the root of the problem. And the gathering evidence, we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. But again, you need to have some traceability to your recommendations to your client. And objective evidence is always much more convincing, in my experience, than, well, we think this. Well, we think this because the evidence points to our conclusion. And then finally, the solution. And the solution types are the same as those for the new performance planning. It's those 4 types of interventions. You know, the training, the environmental, the motivation, and the selection and assignment. In terms of data collection, I know you're all master students. You probably are already pretty good at this. But here are just some examples that Harless has identified. You can collect data. You can interview the employees or the managers or the officers in the company to see what they think. You can observe the workers in the workforce. If you have similar analogous projects or analyses that you've done, you know, there may be some precedents that have been established. And so from previous work, you might have some pretty good ideas on the cause hypotheses. I like that one, gut feeling. Yeah, save that one for last. So 4 possible solutions in the diagnostic FEA process. It's the same ones we talked about before. You can re-engineer the work environment. You can solve skill and knowledge with training or job aids. Or maybe you can put some motivational conditions. You know, maybe if a product isn't selling well, it's because the commission on that product is lower than some of the other products that the sales force tries to sell. So they're not going to waste their time on the low profit or the low incentive product. They're going to sell the stuff where they get a higher commission. And then finally, if the value proposition is not met, if the cost of the cure is worse than the cost of the disease, the organization might have to live with the disease. Unless there's some regulatory reason for them to correct it, in which case, you know, they may pay to remedy the situation. Okay, any questions on the diagnostic? It's there's fewer tasks and phases involved, but the hypothesis generation will require some effort and time.
Smitty, I had one question
Okay.
in regards to collecting the data. So in this example, this is when you would look at your high performers and trying to capture that information as far as, you know, the environment and the observation. You're trying to capture their information first, ideally?
Well, in the execution of this model, talking to the high performers could be helpful. They may be able to help you identify, you know, what is causing the root performance deficiency. You know, they may have figured out a way to avoid it themselves, and maybe they have successfully avoided it themselves, but maybe the other workers in that organization performing similar tasks have not. Or maybe there's barriers in the Detroit plant that don't exist in the Memphis plant. Or maybe the production line in the Detroit plant is older and more antiquated than the production line in the Memphis plant. Again, and these are the things where you kind of have to brainstorm, and you can brainstorm with some of your colleagues at work, or you could brainstorm with the clients.
Okay.
You know, they might be able to point out the fact that, well, yeah, you know, we put a new production line in the Memphis plant 5 years ago, and the one they're using in the Detroit plant, you know, it's 50 years old. Well, yeah, that could be a valid hypothesis.
Yes.
You know, you just need to keep digging on this one until you've exhausted them. You know, if you come up with one or two hypotheses, you know, don't stop. You know, you have to keep thinking to yourself, and there are methods to do that. You know, well, what else could it be? You know, you could always pull out the fishbone diagram, if you know what that is.
Yes.
Hey, it's a pretty simple tool, but it's pretty effective.
Okay.
Did that answer your question?
It did, because just reflecting back when I conducted a front-end analysis in my office, and I did some of the observations, surveys, and a group focus group to get that information. And I did include I guess, an equal amount, in my opinion, of your high to average performers. So I will be able to get more of a picture, but I never really thought of kind of starting with just the high performers, perhaps. So then I would be able to get more of their thoughts specifically on any challenges that they come across or how they tackle a problem.
Right. Was there a particular methodology that you used for your FEA?
In terms of what I was trying to find, well, it was a matter of their productivity that I was trying to understand if they understood what the objective of the department and their particular jobs in general, if they understood how important their performance counts toward students' success and their matriculation.
Right. Was there like a particular methodology that you used? And the reason I ask is, in addition to the Harless process, you know, there are other tools for conducting FEA. Stolovich and Keeps have a similar process for conducting FEAs that's job aids based, that I'm aware of, and I have it here in my bookshelf. And I'm sure there may be others that I'm not aware of, and I'm just kind of interested if the process you used, you know, how did you select it?
And I'm trying to remember actually, because I knew that there was initially a problem, and it was some of the feedback from staff. So I knew that it was a particular issue. So to get to the particular problem, I figured I'd have to include, you know, a random selection of staff that included, you know, all types. But I don't even remember how, what was the exact methodology of it. I had to pull it back up.
Well, yeah, I understand. And, you know, in our discussions tonight, we've been talking about like the accomplished performer and the subject matter expert. Now, in some of these that I've done, we actually interviewed small groups of accomplished performers together. You know, there may be 2 or 3 or 4 where, you know, we get everyone together and we go through the process. You know, and in some cases, you may need to achieve consensus on what the answer is. But in most cases, you know, if these folks are all performing at a high level, usually it's not hard to achieve a consensus answer for your client. I mentioned it's a paper-based system. There is an application that we employed on a few of these. It's software manufactured by a company called Group Systems, and we used Group Systems in at least one project that I remember, again, to gain a consensus answer from more than one accomplished performer. And that was particularly helpful when we were collecting data on attributes such as, you know, speed, complexity, frequency, consequences of error. And I should also mention that I think I failed to mention, and this is a good time to mention it now. When we collect the data from the accomplished performer, and we have a complete set of summary sheets, we usually ask that accomplished performer to review them to make sure that we accurately captured what it is they were trying to tell us. And also, and this is really the role of the subject matter expert, we asked the subject matter expert to review those summary sheets to make sure we didn't miss anything or that we didn't misunderstand something that we were told. And if the subject matter experts come back and tell us, nah, you didn't get this one right, well, we take another look at it. So the subject matter expert is kind of like the quality assurance actor in these processes, whereas we get almost all of the information from the accomplished performer, at least the initial information.
Okay.
Is that helpful?
That does help, yes.
Okay. Are there any other questions?
Smitty, couple of people wanted to know, they're admiring your slides and they want to know if it's possible if they could get access to them.
You know, I really wish I could comply with that request. And I forgot to mention in the beginning that I am not, nor have I ever been, an employee of Saba, and I am not representing Saba this evening. But this is, and I am certified to conduct these workshops, so therefore, you know, I don't feel like I'm violating any proprietary business rules by using these slides this evening, but I just don't think it would be ethical for me to distribute them, and I'm sorry about that.
That's fair enough. I understand.
Now, if there are certain slides of interest about a particular point or two, I may be able to be helpful there.
Okay.
So if the folks want to contact me directly, I can make sure they all have my email.
Okay.
And I'll see what I can do. But again, this is proprietary. It's owned by Saba, and I need to be a little bit careful here.
I totally understand.
Any other thoughts or questions or concerns? We're just about finished. Okay, well, I think we were to the point where we started to talk about some of the best practices in interviewing. And I mentioned in one particular project, we had to get the union to allow us to, enter the workspace and sit down and talk with the union members. And these were actually FAA air route traffic controllers, and these folks have a very powerful union. So, but you know, we explained what we were hoping to achieve, and they were okay with it. So, in some of these bullets here, you know, stick with the job aid. That is your best tactic. And if you don't want to carry the job aid into the workplace, you know, you can take the job aid and make your own outline. But again, you know, you want to impress upon the accomplished performer, and we always do this in the beginning, that, hey, your bosses think you are a rock star. That's why we're talking to you. So, you know, you should take pride in the fact that, you know, someone senior to you thinks highly of your work. It's always best to do it in the workplace if possible. You know, if you can talk to the production line worker on the production line or somewhere close to the production line in case they want to show you something or demonstrate something to you, that's always helpful. And, you know, and if they don't understand the question, you can try rephrasing it a different way. And the job aids actually, in a couple of places, say, you know, if you don't get the answer, try asking it this way. You know, Harless was pretty savvy about that stuff. And when we talk about clarifying soft terms, we mean you need to attempt to compel your accomplished performer to be as precise as possible. So if you know, ask a question, well, how do you calibrate the machine? And the accomplished performer says, well, you know, I turn this dial a little bit to the right. Well, you need to come back and say, well, which dial and how far to the right do you turn it? You know, don't accept those wishy-washy terms like a little bit or, well, you know, I just kind of eyeball it. You know, you really need to sometimes. Some of these folks are a little reluctant to maybe talk to a consultant. If you've seen the movie Office Space, you'll understand why. And again, I mentioned, you know, at the end, review your work with the AP to make sure you didn't misconstrue anything that he or she was trying to communicate to you. And along with the do's, there's some don'ts. You know, try not to get in the way, try not to interfere. You know, certainly don't start any arguments or challenge or try to make an on-the-spot suggestion. You know, just sit there with your pencil and your ears open and allow them to talk. You know, and if they're in the process of describing something to you or they're in the process of answering a question and they pause, let them pause, because they're probably trying to organize their thoughts to make their response to your question as coherent as they can. You know, and some people just, it takes them a while to, you know, to kind of do that. It's that, you know, they're doing this covert behavior and they're trying to come up with an answer, with the right answer. So if they pause in the middle of giving an answer, you know, don't, try not to interrupt them. Or ask them a question until you're fairly certain that they are finished with that answer. Yeah, and sometimes, you know, these APs will try to take over, and you need, you know, you're the one in charge, so don't let them run the session. Okay, so in review, here are our learning objectives. You should be able to now describe alignment in the context of the way Harless describes it. And you should be able to describe these two methodologies. And when we talk about interventions, kind of the 4 categories and some examples, and some interviewing best practices. This is just a small smattering of some of the projects I've done in the last 17 years, some of the more interesting ones anyway. We supported the Air Force 711th Human Systems Wing when they were developing their Predator unmanned unmanned air vehicle program. Being a former Coastie, done several projects for the Coast Guard, introduction of new hardware, introduction of new software that wasn't working. That's what that second one is. Despite repeated attempts, they were having serious problems with this application. And the one there in the lower right corner, that's the FAA control room that involved the interviewing of the FAA controllers. And that concludes my presentation. I'd be happy to stick around and answer any additional questions you might have and entertain any feedback or comments you might have about what we've been talking about in the last couple of hours.
Smitty, Rebecca Dungera has another question here for you. I've tried to unmute her and I'm not successful, so I'll just read the question. Have you been able to identify the top 3 major motivational obstacles for workers across the board, or are they specific to each industry?
I have not, but Dr. Harless, in his 25 years or so doing this, he has come to the conclusion that the number one complaint among workers, and he wasn't specific about which industries, is lack of feedback. Isn't that surprising? Lack of feedback. And maybe at the time that he was doing this, you know, in the 60s and 70s and 80s, maybe employers and managers are better at giving feedback now than perhaps people were 20 or 30 years ago. But that was his observation. It's like, you know, workers don't always know how they're doing until maybe they get an assessment once a year. And depending on the organization, you know, that assessment might be a half a page, or like Booz Allen, it was like 5 pages. Any comments on that in terms of the lack of feedback finding? Is that?
I would concur with that too, because I find that it is still a challenge for some, even for me sometimes, being a frontline manager, and making sure that I'm giving feedback to staff consistently. I would say it's more of the issue. And with that, we did move from a annual performance review to a quarterly. So that is supposed to generate more feedback. But it is still a challenge in some cases to just making sure whether you're giving the constructive or positive feedback on a consistent basis, so staff know how they're performing.
Right, exactly. And you know, it's always been my philosophy as a manager that there should be no unpleasant surprises come assessment time. So when you sit down with someone and you've written their annual assessment and you're debriefing them, there should be no bad surprises. If you've been doing your job as a manager, well, we did quarterly what we called pulse checks, where I sat down with the people who I managed and I made sure that those people sat down with the people that they managed and so on, at least once a quarter. And I expected them to document what was discussed. So the only surprises should be, you did a great job. Here's your salary adjustment. And oh, by the way, here's a bonus for you.
Exactly.
Smitty, this may be related, but I've read it and I can't recall the source, that the number one reason, or one of the top reasons that people leave their jobs or their employers, is that they don't feel appreciated. And that could
Sure.
be a lack of feedback saying, hey, you're doing a good job. We really appreciate what you do. Thanks so much.
Yeah, and on the, I don't know if you recall on the graphic where we talked about some motivational information. You know, we talked, the number one intervention was praise for good work. And so that praise can take many forms. If you have team meetings from time to time, it was something that we certainly were encouraged to do is, you know, you acknowledge someone when they do a good job for their client. We were given, I'm going to say, more than adequate funding to write performance awards. And depending on the level of performance, it was either, at the time I was there, $250, $500, or $1,000. So, you know, if you're a pretty good writer and, you know, when your subordinates did a good job on a project, you know, you write them up and they get a nice plaque and they get $1,000. And when possible, you present that to the employee in front of their peers. And that, you know, that recognition goes a long way, especially some of the junior folks. I mean, I can remember one young lady, she got her first one and she, you know, you thought you just gave her like, you know, $1 million. It was $1,000, but you know, to her, $1,000 was a lot of money. And so, you know, as a manager, if you take care of your people, they're going to take care of you. I know we're getting off the subject here, but again, you know, we're talking about motivation and incentives, and I think that's a pretty good example.
Smitty, thank you for that. Here's a question from Karen. Are there any certifications, yours or other ones that you know about, that you would recommend for an ISD who wants to move into or be able to do performance improvement on a more advanced level?
In terms of certifications to do HPT, you know, I'm really not aware of any formal certification in HPT or HPI, although they may exist. But you know, there are certainly a lot of learning opportunities and training opportunities to help you improve your skills in that area. And I know, I don't know if Carol Erdman is still teaching her class, but that was one of the classes at UMBC that I found to be very helpful and very informative, even though I'd been working in the field for 3 or 4 years at the time I took her class. And ISPE and some of these other learning organizations, what used to be ASTD, I think it's ATD now, right?
Right.
You know, there may be some training available from those organizations.
How about the certified performance technologist from ISPI? Is that something that's a possibility, or it doesn't hit the mark for this particular topic, or?
Oh no, it certainly does. And that certification, at the time I got it, it was more experience-based as compared to, say, a project management professional certification, which required experience in a certain number of training hours in relevant subject matter. So, you know, there are a lot of organizations that teach project management. And so, you know, you take a couple of those courses, you get your requisite number of hours that you need to apply for the credential, and then you have to document so many hours of experience, in the case of the PMP, in certain areas of project management, you know, like scheduling and cost, and quality assurance. Whereas at the time I got the CPT credential, it was more experience based, documenting your experiences in certain categories.
Okay,
They may be out there now. I just can't think of any specific ones other than like a university course. Although maybe the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society might have some formal training that might be appropriate.
So just out of curiosity, of the certifications that you have, which one do you use the most often? Like what you learned to get the certification, thinking in terms of that kind of information, that kind of learning, what do you use the most often?
Well, in my work, I would have to say the project management is almost universal. My only regret with the project management is that I didn't do it sooner. I found it to be very helpful for me in my career, as a project manager and a program manager. Of course, I was sort of a jack of all trades and a master of none. I didn't exclusively do human performance improvement. And I didn't really do a lot of hardcore instructional design and development. Most of my work was in the analysis phases as it relates to human performance improvement and instructional design. And, at Booz Allen, we had a whole team of designers and developers that could do the design and development work much quicker and much better than I could. I took a couple of classes there at UMBC on, using some of these software programs, Dreamweaver, et cetera. And I could do it, but I couldn't do it as good as they could do it. And I was also too expensive compared to what they were paid to do the design and the development. So most of my work in the field was in the analysis part, to be quite honest.
Good to know.
Yeah, but knowing how to run the project, knowing how to manage cost, schedule, and performance of your team in doing these analysis projects, the PMP certification was very valuable. And even if you don't get the certification, if you just learn the principles, that'll get you a long way. But if you're going to bother to learn the principles, you might as well get certified.
That's on my list.
And the government for a while was requiring a PMP certification for key personnel involved in some of the projects that they awarded. I mean, you had to have the PMP in order to be the project manager.
Good to know.
So that's what drove me to get it was, and Booz Allen paid for it. So I'm thinking, well, why not?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But my regret is I wish I'd have done it, 20 years earlier. It would have saved me a lot of headaches and reinventing the wheel.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, Smitty. This was Dave. So just out of curiosity, when it comes to the other things that you find, because I know that most people that are in the session here, we're all kind of on the learning and development end of things. So when you're doing your analysis and when you come across performance roadblocks that are not related to the learning and development end, what degree of involvement do you have in terms of seeing those through to completion, or is it just more in the sense of you bring it to the stakeholders' attention and then you just kind of say do with this what you will?
That's a very good question, And it varies from engagement to engagement. And sometimes, we were retained just to do the FEA piece. But that is not to say that it didn't result in follow-on work. So, at the end of the project, you present your findings and your recommendations, and then we would always try to include some next steps. And that is usually how we would end the end of project briefing to the client and deliver the final report. And, and that dialogue would go, okay, so we, here are our recommendations. We recommend you develop this training. We recommend you, hire someone to, get an industrial engineer to redesign your production line because it's, you're wasting a lot of time in the way it's arranged currently. Those kinds of things. And then we would say next steps. And then we would, maybe hand them a white paper and say, hey, we've got we have industrial engineers at Booz Allen, we can help you implement some of these things that we have recommended. And then sometimes you get follow-on work and sometimes you don't. Sometimes they want to hire somebody else to do it, or sometimes they want to try to do it themselves. So, it varies. And I hope that answers the mail for you.
Yes, that was like excellent. I was just wondering if, there was any kind of driving on completion that you did on that end, but that's kind of more what I expected. So thank you.
Sure. Yeah, and sometimes, the contract award will include, and help us implement your recommendations. It just depends on how they write the contract. It depends on the statement of work.
Folks, are there any other
Any
questions?
other questions or comments?
Smitty?
I have one last question, I think.
Sure.
I'm kind of curious in regards to results and your findings. Are they typically, do you typically recommend in your results as far as metrics and accountability? And does the performer typically, are they aware of what their performance metrics are, so then they can gauge where they ideally would need to perform in regards to what the goal is or whatever the objective?
Sure. That's a good question, and all of my work has been in the government sector. And for those of you that, and I know some of you are associated with the government, the federal government, and they are very strict on complying with the contract and delivering in accordance with the statement of work, which describes what it is that you are to hand over to them, or something also known as a performance work statement, which is essentially the same thing. And so if the contract and the performance work statement, if that was called for, if that was within scope of the project, then yes. Otherwise, no, because it's not legal for companies to give the government goods and services for free. So if you don't comply with the agreed upon scope, you could get your company in trouble, and you could get that government organization in trouble if they accept it. If they accept what you have given them that's not within the scope of the contract.
Oh. See, I'm
So,
unfamiliar with that aspect of with government because
right.
public
So,
education.
yeah, in a commercial setting, you know, I could see situations where you might be tempted to go above and beyond what you promised in writing to deliver, you know, and again, in the hopes of follow-on work. But in the government realm, no, it's illegal. You can't do it. You could get yourself in trouble, and you could get your client in trouble if they accept it, and someone finds out.
All righty.
Yeah, those things are pretty. Most of them are pretty tightly worded in terms of, you know, requirements to satisfy the contract.
Melody, I was able to unmute you. I was trying to, and I was unable to. So I don't know if you had a comment or a question that you wanted to make.
I don't have a question. I do have pages and pages of notes, but I did want to say I really appreciate all the information given to us tonight, and thanks, Smitty, for his time.
Well, you're very welcome. This is something that I really enjoy doing, and I've just had so many interesting engagements, as you've probably been able to surmise, by virtue of the fact that, you know, I'm trained in the process. And I've also trained a fair number of other people in the process. And Paul Elliott down in Annapolis, I just exchanged emails with him a couple weeks ago in getting ready for this. And he also still conducts these workshops and trains people in the process, and holds workshops from time to time. So again, his name is Paul Elliott, and his company is Exemplary Performance.
That's good to know. He's in my neck of the woods.
Yes, yeah, and he's just one of the nicest gentlemen you'd ever want to meet. And you know, when you go to his website and you see some of his clients, I mean, we're talking about heavy hitters. You know, I don't know how you feel about Bill Gates and Microsoft, but he's done a lot of work for companies like Microsoft and some others.
Okay.
Any other questions or comments for Smitty? All right. I'm not hearing anything or not seeing any chats or anything, so I guess we're good. I think Smitty is certainly not typical, but he is I think he's atypical. I think he's exceptional. He is a good reason why I run this class the way I run it, to bring in folks from the outside, because he is an expert on performance improvement and specifically on analysis, which is kind of cool. So I think, you know, and I always learn a lot from him every time I hear him speak. So Smitty, thank you very much. I really appreciate your time and effort. I know you're very diligent. I know you're very thorough and dedicated, and you do a great job of giving back to our program here at UMBC. And we're proud to have you as an alumni.
Well, I'm a proud alumni. Thanks, Greg. And again, thanks for the kind comments, and I do appreciate everyone's questions. I think you had some really excellent questions. And I don't know if you can see it on your screen here. There's bonus material, a link to a YouTube video And if you don't have it, we can make sure that we email it out to you. But I believe it was a video of the ISPI 2012 annual convention where Dr. Harless and Dr. Elliott and there was one other presenter whose name escapes me, did a presentation at ISPI. And so if you have consumed the HPT Kool-Aid by this point, you might want to watch that video.
Thank you, Smitty. That's great
Yeah.
info to share.
I do think that you know, that these organizations have annual conventions and they usually have workshops on a variety of topics. So I wouldn't be surprised if at the next ISPI convention there will be some training workshops available on, you know, related topics.
All right. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Okay, folks, I think that about does it for tonight. I will get the video processed tomorrow and make it available to you, so you will have that for your viewing pleasure. And I will also remind you again that next week we're going to start at 7:30 instead of 6:30. So I'll just make sure to mention that to you again and maybe send you a little email announcement reminder of that as well. Until then, have a good evening, and we'll see you online. Smitty, thanks again.
Oh, you're very welcome, and thanks, everyone.